The fjord is a canyon of shadow and mist. Wind comes off the ice cap like something alive, probing into the airplane's seams. The crew can't see the runway yet. They're not supposed to, not until the last bend opens suddenly into a flat tongue of land that looks like it shouldn't be long enough or level enough for anything bigger than a local fishing boat. The altimeter creeps down. In the right-hand seat, a co-pilot whispers the radio range ident like a talisman, ears ringing from the engine note, and the near-constant hiss of ice crystals scouring the windshield. A green valley finally flashes below, and then the fjord throws a wall of mountain at the left window. That is southern Greenland. And this is where America taught bombers to climb a frozen staircase to Europe, one hop at a time. The route had a sardonic nickname, the Snowball Route. On pilots' charts, it was the North Atlantic Ferry chain, a sequence of hops from Presque Isle to Goose Bay to a place the Americans called WWII, up a fjord and into a landscape of ice, then a leg to Iceland, and finally a run to Scotland. The chain wasn't elegant, but it worked. In 1942 and 1943, it worked well enough to change the arithmetic of a global war. Greenland was never Plan A. It became the plan when every other option looked worse, and the urgency to reinforce Britain made the ocean feel smaller than it really was. In 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, the United States started carving a path across the map for Lend-Lease and, soon enough, for its own combat groups. When Major General Carl Spaatz' order crackled across the Atlantic to start the big move, Operation Bolero, fighters and bombers pushed off from Maine and Labrador and aimed at a mountainous island that almost never had good weather. But good wasn't the point. Predictable was. In Greenland, there would be a runway you could reach, if the alternative was ditching in an ocean that didn't forgive mistakes. That runway sat at the very end of a 40-mile fjord, chiseled deep into the rock. Most approaches went in low, following the water until a wrecked ship, an unofficial landmark, came into view, a cue to turn right and commit to the sloped strip. Even seasoned crews described the sensation as flying into a cul-de-sac and hoping the cul-de-sac made room. A simple piece of steel made the airfield possible. Pierced steel planking, PSP or Marston mat, let engineers unroll a runway across a glacial outwash surface that would otherwise chew aircraft into scrap. Think of it as a giant, perforated armor for the Earth, hooked together sheet by sheet until there was enough strength and drainage to let a loaded bomber touch down without tearing the ground to pieces. The first of these mats in Greenland went down in late 1941 and early 1942, just in time for the winter, when the ocean lanes were at their worst and the Allied need was at its peak. Without this matting, Greenland would have been a set of weather stations and a promise. With it, there was suddenly a place for a B-17 to grease on, fuel, and go. Engineers didn't just fight mud, they fought ice. The runway at WWII sat on a moraine, a geologic memory of the glacier that still crouched at the fjord's head. Frost heave could turn any flat surface into something with a personality. Drainage ditches were as important as the runway itself. Keeping the mat dry meant keeping it strong. Farther north, at Sundre Strömfjord, WWII, crews laid a sand base and asphaltic macadam directly on an elevated river terrace, distant enough from the tidal reach to keep the subgrade frozen and stable. Both sites were chosen because the land, the river, and the ice all conspired to offer the least bad option. In summer, they were gravel and steel. In winter, something different happened. Snow hardened to a brick-like surface. Fjords locked up. Temporary ice and snow surfaces weren't the primary ferry runways, but they became critical staging and rescue platforms when the weather turned vindictive and crews needed somewhere, anywhere, to stop, repair, or launch help. In Greenland, the ice runway wasn't a single place. It was a seasonal capability that made the fixed fields viable year-round. Every ferry pilot learned the ritual: Presque Isle to Goose Bay, then the long leg east. If Reykjavik or Keflavik went down in snow, the recall signal meant turning back for Greenland, before a fuel calculation turned from arithmetic into prayer. There were nights when the call came late, and crews rode the wind back toward the fjords with fumes in the tanks. The common wisdom said you could always bail out over the ice cap, and some crews did, but the people who worked the radios at WWII knew why that was the last resort. An egress over an infinite white plain could swap one danger for another, and surviving the landing didn't mean surviving the cold. Getting the runway lights on, sometimes literally reopening a wind-closed field by force of necessity, saved airplanes and men. That calculus, grim as it was, is what kept the chain intact through its worst winters. If the runway was the backbone, the fjord was the throat. To fly into Narsarsuaq was to accept a kind of funneling geography. The ice cap fell toward the sea in slow motion, hurling weather forward as it came. The approach mirrored the land. Down the waterway, right at the ship's bones, flare on the slope. Pilots joked that the airfield was one way because the mountain had the other direction reserved. In truth, operations often demanded landings upslope and takeoffs downslope, regardless of wind, because the topography dictated the playbook. Modern pilots who ferry over the same country still write about how tight it feels, how the minimums climb, how terrain intrudes on the final approach path. In the 1940s, crews did it on the most primitive instruments imaginable, backed by radio ranges, and a kind of communal lore passed from cockpit to cockpit. What made this more than a daring approach was the volume. During the peak years, thousands upon thousands of aircraft used the Greenland stops. Estimates put landings at BW-1 alone in the 5 figures. B-17s and B-24s did it, but so did P-38s, shepherded by flying fortresses as navigation mothers over the long, cold water. Every arrival had a story, and every story had the same refrain. The runway was there. That mattered more than anything else. Each successful hop shortened the time between a factory floor in California or New York and a dispersal at Prestwick. As the movement gathered speed, the loss rate stayed lower than early pessimists feared, proof that the chain, imperfect and improvised, was robust enough to feed a war. Still, the ice reminded everyone who ruled the place. On July 15, 1942, 6 P-38s and 2 B-17s turned around by lethal weather between Greenland and Iceland, ran out of options and fuel, and put down on the ice cap. The press would later turn them into legend, the Lost Squadron. The recovery and later resurrection of one Lightning would become an aviation folktale. But in the moment, what mattered was that the ice could hold airplanes if it had to. Rescue flights and ground parties fanned out from coastal bases and, when feasible, used hardened snow surfaces as ad hoc strips to support the search. This is the part of the Greenland story where ice runway is literal, not a paved field with frost problems, but a frozen surface that in extremis became a runway because crews had no other choice. Those capabilities, ski-equipped aircraft, tracked vehicles, and the skill to read snow like a map were never the main act. Yet they were the reason a bad day didn't metastasize into a strategic failure. On the other coast, a different safety net took shape at Ikatek, codenamed Bluey East 2. Cut into a fjord wilderness near Angmagssalik, the field didn't host the same traffic as BW-1, but it mattered for weather, navigation, and search and rescue. Its 5,000-foot runway provided a hard surface, and in winter, the surrounding frozen country gave SAR crews more options than a map suggested. East Greenland was harder, colder, and more remote, but the presence of even a modest strip meant a place to stage help when aircraft went down on the ice or when ferry traffic needed a last-ditch alternate. None of this would have been possible without a parallel effort that sounds mundane until you stand on a January ramp in -20 and watch water freeze in motion, weather, and radio. A lattice of stations along the route, some of them simply huts with heroic personnel inside, pushed out observations that told pilots whether the fjord would be flyable at all. Forecasting in mountains abutting an ice sheet was closer to art than science, but the art improved every month. The goal wasn't perfect prediction. It was narrowing the window where a crew would be forced to choose between an ocean and a glacier at night. WWII 8's mid-Greenland location, with more stable inland weather than the coast, made it a crucial Plan B when Narsarsuaq went down in clag. That redundancy, one paved field backed by another, backed by winter ice procedures, was the quiet genius of the system. This is also the place where the story widens from airplanes to minerals and ships. Just down the coast, the U.S. Navy stood up a major operating base near an unremarkable Greenlandic village, because nearby was Ivitut, the world's richest cryolite mine. You don't roll aluminum into wings without electrolytic smelting, and in the 1940s, that process leaned on cryolite. Protecting that mine kept airframes flowing to the very factories that built the machines landing at BW-1. In practice, WWII 7 at Grunedal became the maritime hinge of the southern Greenland story. Coast Guard cutters, PBYs on the slips, convoy escorts, and a fueling point in a fjord that almost never froze shut. Air, sea, and the ground underfoot formed one campaign. By the time our opening B-17 taxis clear in the fjord's gray light, the larger picture is visible. An airfield on steel mat laid over a glacial scar. Another field an hour's flight inland where the weather is a little less fickle. A lesser-known strip on the east coast for met and rescue. A winter habit of treating snow and ice as usable infrastructure when the calendar demands it. Tugboats nudging icebergs from a departure path, as though that were a normal line item in the ops plan. Add it all together, and you get a bridge of air over a killing ocean, built from steel sheets, weather charts, and the stubbornness to fly up a fjord again tomorrow. They came ashore with shovels, graders, and an impossible timetable. The Army engineers and civilian contractors who arrived in Greenland in 1941 and 1942 faced conditions no manual had ever really prepared them for. Permafrost was not like ordinary soil. In summer, it melted to a layer of mud that swallowed bulldozers whole. In winter, it turned to stone, unyielding, even to dynamite. Between those two extremes, they had to build runways strong enough to catch bombers weighing more than 30 tons. WWII 1 at Narsarsuaq was chosen not because it was ideal, but because it was the least impossible. A wide bend in the fjord offered a terrace of gravel and glacial till. It sloped uphill, which was both a blessing and a curse. Landings were slower, but takeoffs were committed the moment the throttle advanced. Crews hacked out drainage ditches, laid down fill, and then unrolled Marston matting in a process that looked more like carpentry than engineering. Each sheet of pierced steel had to hook into its neighbor just right. Otherwise, the whole surface rippled. Men swung hammers in freezing winds, their breath frosting the very tools in their hands, turning nuts and bolts with fingers gone stiff from the cold. Farther north, at Zundra Strömfjord, later called WWII 8, the site selection came after long surveys. Here, the terrain offered a river terrace with firmer ground. Engineers trucked in sand and compacted it with rollers dragged behind tractors, layering it like a giant cake before topping it with asphaltic macadam. The result was a runway that held up better in summer than Narsarsuaq's matting. Still, the challenges were endless. Frost heave cracked their careful work. Storms blew sand across the field. and when autumn rains came, every culvert had to be watched like a hawk. A single, blocked drain could ripple the surface, lifting the mats and leaving dangerous bumps where wheels could snap struts. The engineers fought back with ingenuity. They experimented with layered gravel, mixing in ash from camp boilers to improve drainage. They lined ditches with logs cut from driftwood or imported from Canada. They built retaining walls from boulders rolled down from the hillsides, then froze them into place with sprayed water that hardened into ice cement. Every technique was improvised. Nothing about building on Greenland's edges was normal, yet everything had to work at once, or men and machines would pay the price. Construction was only half the battle. Supply was the other half. Everything came by ship, pushed across the Atlantic under the constant threat of U-boats, crates of Marston matting, barrels of asphalt, spare parts for graders and bulldozers. Every item represented a gamble. Losses at sea meant shortages on land. Crews learned to hoard nails, to scavenge broken planks, to straighten bent steel with sledgehammers so it could be reused. Waste was a luxury they could not afford. Living conditions reflected the same harsh balance. Barracks were drafty, the stoves burned coal or fuel oil with choking fumes, and the ever-present damp crept into everything. Men slept in long rows of bunks, the sound of wind rattling the walls a constant reminder of where they were. In summer, clouds of mosquitoes drove them nearly insane, swarming in from the marshes whenever the wind died. In winter, the silence was absolute, broken only by the groan of ice shifting in the fjord. Yet morale held because the work had urgency. Every yard of matting laid meant another aircraft could pass through on its way to the front. Pilots who landed at BW1 or BW8 often wrote later that they could not believe runways had been carved out of such forbidding terrain. What they saw on final approach was a ribbon of steel or asphalt, shining with frost, clinging to a ledge of rock between cliffs and water. They did not see the weeks of back-breaking labor, the bulldozers that sank up to their axles, the dynamite charges that barely dented the frozen ground. But the engineers saw it. They carried those memories home. Some wrote in journals that the work was harder than combat. There were no medals for drainage ditches, but those ditches kept airplanes safe, and when winter came, the concept of the runway itself shifted. Snow hardened to such a degree that it could be shaped into a flat surface strong enough to bear aircraft. Crews learned to roll and pack it, turning it into an extension of the man-made fields. Fjords that froze became temporary landing strips for lighter aircraft, rescue planes, and supply drops. The line between engineered runways and nature's own surfaces blurred. To the ferry pilots, it made no difference. What mattered was that something solid waited below when the fuel gauges sagged toward empty. By the end of 1942, Greenland had 2 functional airfields and a growing web of smaller outposts. What had begun as an experiment had hardened into infrastructure. Engineers had proved that with enough steel, sweat, and stubbornness, you could land a flying fortress on the edge of the Arctic. They did not know then how many thousands of airplanes would follow, but they knew they had built something that worked. The ice, the rock, and the sea had given them nothing. The pilots called it the snowball route for a reason. You started at Presque Isle or Goose Bay with a clean airplane and a hopeful forecast. But by the time you reached Greenland, you carried a snowball's chance against weather that could shift in a heartbeat. The Atlantic below was a dark, merciless sheet. The ice cap ahead, a white void without horizon. Somewhere in between, a runway waited, if you could find it. The route itself looked simple on the map. From Maine or Labrador, head east to Greenland, refuel, then on to Iceland, and finally Scotland. In reality, it was a string of risks. Pilots in P-38s and P-40s had to fly in formation with a mothership, often a B-24 or B-17 outfitted with extra radio gear. Navigation across open water demanded precision, and there were no modern aids beyond a radio range, a sextant, and dead reckoning. Crews joked that you could tell how new a pilot was by how tightly he gripped his chart. Veterans learned to trust their compasses and their gut. But even then, the North Atlantic had a way of humbling everyone. Greenland loomed as both promise and threat. If you made it to WWII West 1, you could take a breath, refuel, and reset. But getting in required nerve. The fjord approach was long, narrow, and unforgiving. Pilots were briefed to follow the water, find the rusting hull of a wrecked ship, then make a hard turn and commit. Once you dropped into the valley, there was no going around. A mountain waited at the other end. More than one pilot admitted that his hands shook on the yoke as he lined up for that final slope. They had trained on wide, flat runways in the States. Now they were threading a bomber through a rock corridor, just to touch down on a steel mat frozen into the earth. Those who flew fighters had their own trials. Long-range P-38s made the crossing with twin engines and drop tanks, but single-engine types were riskier. Pilots wore immersion suits in case they had to ditch in the icy sea, though few believed survival time would be more than minutes. Some flights lost stragglers to fuel miscalculation, weather, or simple disorientation. The ocean claimed them quietly, leaving only silence on the radio. For every squadron that landed intact, another carried scars, an empty bunk, a call sign never answered again. Night crossings were even harsher. In polar twilight, the world turned into shades of gray where sky and sea were indistinguishable. Instruments became lifelines. Crews reported hallucinations, thinking they saw a coastline when it was cloud, or believing the plane was banking when it was level. Fatigue set in quickly, especially for young pilots barely out of training. They had been promised adventure. What they found was endurance. And yet, many remembered Greenland as a strange kind of salvation. When Reykjavik was socked in by snow, when fog blanketed Scotland, the airfields at Narsarsuaq and Sundre Strömfjord were often the difference between life and loss. Ground crews kept runway lights burning through storms, sweeping snow with makeshift plows built from scrap metal. Radio operators sat through endless shifts, tapping out weather reports and beacons for pilots who might never reach them. The men on the ground understood that every voice, crackling through the static, might belong to someone choosing between ocean, ice, or a narrow strip of steel. Rescue flights became their own rhythm. Ski-equipped aircraft waited for distress calls, ready to venture onto the ice cap. They carried supplies, doctors, and sometimes only hope. Stories spread of pilots who landed on hardened snow, loaded shivering men into cabins, and clawed back into the air with engines straining in the thin, frigid atmosphere. Those missions blurred the line between official duty and acts of mercy. They kept the snowball route alive because they proved that failure on one leg did not always mean the end. The crews who ferried airplanes through Greenland were not frontline aces, but without them, the front lines would have gone silent. Each successful crossing meant another bomber, another squadron of fighters, another chance for Britain to hold out and for the Allies to strike back. Their courage was measured not in dogfights, but in hours of blind flight, in trusting a compass needle over their own senses, in lining up on a runway carved into a fjord at the edge of the world. For them, Greenland was never just a stopover. It was the narrow bridge between two continents, the fulcrum of a strategy that turned geography into a weapon. They knew it every time they descended into the gray light of the fjord, engines echoing off rock walls, steel mat flashing below. Survival was never guaranteed, but the runway was there, and that was enough. They had taken what they needed anyway. When things went wrong in Greenland, they went wrong quickly. Weather could shift from clear skies to zero visibility in minutes. Fuel margins were razor thin. One miscalculation, one clogged carburetor, one gust funneled down the fjord could turn a ferry mission into a fight for survival. That is why the rescue crews and their makeshift ice runways became as vital to the war effort as the bombers themselves. The most famous story is the lost squadron. On July 15, 1942, 6 P-38s and 2 B-17s left Greenland for Iceland. Midway, storms closed in. They turned back, but the weather behind them had worsened. With fuel gauges dropping, they faced the cruel arithmetic of the North Atlantic. Water below, ice above, no visible runway anywhere. The crews made the only choice left. They climbed toward the ice cap, picked flat spots in the endless whiteness, and sat down on the snow. Every man survived the landings, though the airplanes were swallowed by ice and forgotten for decades. In that moment, the ice itself had become their runway, a frozen field of last resort that kept dozens of airmen alive. Rescue missions began immediately. Ski-equipped aircraft clawed their way up onto the ice, carrying supplies and hope. Sled teams and tracked vehicles followed, their engines howling in the polar wind. Crews built temporary strips by packing snow until it could bear the weight of lighter planes. Radios cracked with messages that barely made it through static, guiding rescuers toward flares fired from the stranded camp. The ice had trapped the aircraft, but it had not claimed the men. That pattern repeated throughout the war. A B-17, known as the PNN-90E, ferrying crews along the same route, went down in fog on the ice cap in 1942. Rescue attempts stretched for weeks. Men endured starvation rations, frostbite, and blizzards that buried their wreck deeper each night. Aircraft circled overhead, looking for flashes of sunlight on metal or the faint movement of men waving cloths against the snow. Eventually, survivors were hauled out in one of the most harrowing operations of the Arctic campaign. These missions showed why Greenland's ice runways were more than just words. Engineers and pilots learned to treat snow as a surface that could be managed, shaped, and trusted, at least long enough to save lives. They carved strips with bulldozers, tamped the snow until it was hard as stone, and marked the boundaries with smoke pots. Pilots who landed on those makeshift runways described it as like touching down on glass. Every wheel slide a reminder that they were guests in a hostile land. Yet those strips worked again and again, pulling men back from death. The Coast Guard played its part too. Amphibious planes skimmed fjords, searching for life rafts or smoke signals. Cutters braved pack ice to deliver supplies and carry the injured back to base. They could not change the weather, but they could give the stranded a chance. To the ferry pilots, the sight of a PBY Catalina circling overhead after a forced landing was as comforting as any fortress of steel. It meant someone was still looking for them. Every success reinforced the system. Word spread that if you went down, rescue would come. Morale improved. Pilots pushed forward knowing they had more than luck on their side. The very existence of ice runways, temporary, improvised, perilous, made the ferry route viable. Without them, every storm could have been fatal, every turn back a death sentence. With them, the odds shifted just enough. The Atlantic remained merciless, but Greenland gave men a fighting chance. Years later, veterans remembered the terror of those moments not as defeat, but as proof of resilience. They spoke of the endless white horizon, the strange quiet after shutting down engines on the ice, and the roar of rescue planes dropping out of the clouds. To them, Greenland was both a trap and a savior. The ice could bury an airplane forever, but it could also catch it in time. That paradox defined the snowball route as much as any chart or radio beacon. It was a bridge of steel, sweat, and ice, and it worked because men refused to let each other slip through its cracks. Weather was the true enemy in Greenland. Mountains could be mapped, icebergs charted, but the sky itself remained unpredictable, shifting without warning. Crews spoke of sunlight one moment and snow squalls the next, of crystal-clear horizons turning into white walls in the time it took to pour a cup of coffee. To master the snowball route, the Allies had to fight not with guns, but with barometers, thermometers, and radios. Before the war, Greenland was a blank spot on most weather charts. Few ships ventured close, and fewer still recorded data. Forecasts were educated guesses at best. But when America decided to ferry thousands of aircraft across the North Atlantic, the blank spot had to be filled. Suddenly, weather stations became as important as airfields. Small teams of men, often isolated for months at a time, endured the cold to measure winds, clouds, and pressure. Their reports traveled by radio back to bases in Canada, Iceland, and Britain, where forecasters pieced together the puzzle of the polar sky. Some of these stations were barely more than huts perched on rock outcrops. Others, like the ones near the ice cap, were full-scale camps with their own generators, fuel stores, and emergency shelters. The men who worked them faced conditions harsher than any combat. Winds screamed through their antennas, rattling walls until sleep was impossible. Ice formed on every surface. Fuel lines froze solid. Yet every hour, no matter the storm, they stepped outside to release weather balloons, their hands numb as they struggled to tie instruments to strings stiffened by frost. Their data saved lives. A single coded report of shifting winds at altitude could mean the difference between a bomber making Iceland or vanishing into the ocean. Pilots trusted those voices, though they rarely saw the men behind them. To the ferry crews, the forecast came as a scratchy burst of static, a clipped voice reading out pressure and cloud cover. They never knew the face of the man who had trudged through waist-deep snow to launch the balloon that made those numbers possible. But they knew those numbers were the closest thing to safety they would ever get. Greenland's geography made forecasting almost impossible by normal standards. The ice cap generated its own weather. Cold air spilled down valleys like invisible rivers, colliding with warm Atlantic currents to create fog thick as concrete. Katabatic winds poured off the ice, blasting through fjords at hurricane strength. A clear sky at dawn could hide a blizzard by noon. Forecasts often amounted to little more than a window of relative stability, a chance to gamble. Yet even that window mattered. Without it, the snowball route would have been blind roulette. WWII West 8 became a linchpin for weather reporting. Its inland location offered slightly more stable conditions than the coastal fields. From there, observations went out not only to ferry pilots, but to the entire North Atlantic Command. Narsarsuaq, sitting at the end of its fjord, provided another critical viewpoint. Together, these stations created a chain of eyes that watched the skies from Labrador to Iceland. Each link was fragile, but together they offered just enough warning to keep the air bridge alive. The men who manned these posts developed a strange relationship with the weather. They came to read the sky like a book. They could tell a storm's arrival by the sound of the wind in the antennas, by the color of the horizon above the ice cap, by the way the fjord waters shifted from blue to gray. They learned to fear certain cloud shapes, to recognize when sunlight carried a shimmer that meant ice crystals were already forming at altitude. This knowledge was not in manuals. It was earned, day by day, frostbite by frostbite. Rescue crews depended on the same forecasts. When an aircraft went missing, weather dictated whether help could even be launched. A fogged-in fjord could keep ski planes grounded, while men froze on the ice above. A lucky gap in the clouds might open a corridor just wide enough for Catalina to slip through. Success was always balanced on the edge of nature's moods, and no act of bravery could overcome a closed sky. That is why the weathermen were quietly revered, even if their names never made the papers. Veterans later admitted that they remembered the voices of weather operators almost as vividly as the roar of their engines. Those clipped broadcasts meant someone was watching the same sky, someone trying to guide them through. It gave them a sense of connection across the void. The Atlantic might stretch forever, but a man in a hut on a Greenland ridge was part of their team. That sense of unseen camaraderie mattered as much as the numbers themselves. The war in Greenland was, in many ways, a war of patience with the weather. Pilots waited on frozen runways for a favorable report. Ships lingered in fjords until fog lifted. Engineers stopped work until the wind died. Progress moved in fits and starts, dictated by the sky. But in those pauses, in those hours of waiting, the system held. Men grumbled, but they knew it was better than gambling with blindness. Slowly, painfully, the rhythm of weather and flight became routine. The ice runways were more than steel and snow. They were anchored by forecasts, by the thin thread of radio voices reporting on the shifting moods of the Arctic sky. Without those voices, the runways would have been useless, because no one could have reached them in time. With them, Greenland became not just a place on the map, but a lifeline across an ocean. And though the men who made it possible rarely left their posts, their work echoed in every engine that lifted off for the next leg east. The story of Greenland's airfields cannot be told without the sea. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of matting, every barrel of oil had to cross the same waters that U-boats prowled. Beneath the drama of fjord approaches and ice runways lay a quieter struggle, protecting the supply lines and a single mineral deposit that mattered as much as steel itself. At a place called Ivitut in southwest Greenland, men mined something few outside the industry had ever heard of: cryolite. This pale mineral was indispensable to the smelting of aluminum. Without it, aluminum oxide could not be reduced efficiently into the lightweight metal that formed every wing spar, every skin panel, every bomb bay door of America's aircraft. In 1940, Ivitut was the world's only major source. That made Greenland a strategic prize far beyond its runways. Whoever controlled that mine controlled the flow of aluminum to Allied factories. The United States moved quickly. In 1941, with Denmark under German occupation, American forces landed in Greenland under agreement with the local colonial administration. The justification was defense, but everyone knew what truly mattered: keep cryolite out of German hands. Naval bases sprang up in fjords, anchoring a new defensive line. One of them, Bluey West 7 at Grønnedal, became the maritime hinge of the southern coast. Here, destroyers and Coast Guard cutters tied up against cliffs, their decks bristling with anti-submarine gear. Convoy escorts fueled in its sheltered waters. Seaplanes rose from its slips to hunt U-boats, and supply vessels paused before braving the Atlantic again. The link between sea and air was immediate. Without secure ports, the airfields could not be supplied. Without the airfields, ferry traffic risked collapse. The two arms of the campaign were locked together. Crews at WWII remembered watching aircraft thunder overhead, while their own sonar operators tracked submarines just outside the fjord. It was a double game of endurance. One fought in the skies above the ice, the other in the black water below. The U-boat threat was never abstract. In the summer of 1942, wolf packs ranged along Greenland's approaches, sinking tankers and transports. Survivors described clinging to rafts in seas so cold they numbed the body within minutes. Naval patrols pulled men from the water when they could, but often arrived too late. To the engineers waiting inland, every late ship meant shortages: fewer steel sheets for the runways, less fuel for the plows, fewer rations for the camps. Logistics was as fragile as glass. Coast Guard air crews added another layer. Their PBY Catalinas, flying boats with long legs and patient wings, scoured the fjords and coastal lanes. They escorted convoys in and out of the bases, sometimes dropping depth charges on suspected submarines, more often just keeping watch. The same aircraft were called upon for rescues on the ice cap, shifting from anti-submarine patrol to lifeline within hours. In Greenland, roles blurred. Sailors became weather reporters, aviators became rescuers, miners became guards. Everyone bent toward the single purpose of keeping the bridge to Europe intact. Life at the naval stations was its own test of endurance. Grunedal lay in a fjord chiseled out of rock, with cliffs rising like walls. Ships brought supplies when seas allowed, but the men stationed there often described a sense of isolation deeper than any convoy run. Storms could trap vessels in port for days, while icebergs drifted dangerously close to the piers. Yet from this remote anchorage, convoys were staged that carried fuel and parts to the air bases, and from there to the aircraft pressing eastward. Protecting Ivitut was not glamorous work, but it mattered. Patrols circled the mine constantly. Anti-aircraft guns were placed against the slim chance of German raids. Workers lived under guard, their shifts mining cryolite as crucial to the war as the pilots risking their lives in the sky. Veterans would later say that they knew little of global strategy, but they knew that without their work, no B-24 would fly, no P-51 would roll off the line. By knitting together the mine, the fjord bases, and the ice airfields, the United States created a system resilient enough to endure. Each piece supported the others. If the mine fell, the airfields were irrelevant. If the sea was lost, the runways would starve. If the runways failed, the ferry chain collapsed. It was a delicate balance, but one that held even through the worst years of 1942 and 1943. In hindsight, the image of Greenland's role is often reduced to a map, dots marking WWII West 1, West 8, East 2. But in truth, it was an ecosystem. Rock, ice, fjord, and mineral together formed a node of strategy as vital as any island in the Pacific or beach in Normandy. And at its heart was a simple fact. A mine no one had heard of and runways no one expected could help carry a continent's worth of bombers to war. The measure of Greenland's success was not in headlines, but in numbers. Between 1942 and 1945, thousands of aircraft crossed the Atlantic along the snowball route. Each one represented weeks of labor in American factories, the sweat of engineers on frozen runways, and the courage of crews willing to gamble against the North Atlantic. When historians look back, they see a flow of machines. The men who were there remembered a relentless tempo, an assembly line stretched across an ocean. At WWII West 1, the runway never rested. Bombers came in at dawn, refueled, and were gone again by afternoon. Fighters, smaller and more fragile, were shepherded by heavy aircraft, landing in groups like chicks following a hen. The roar of engines echoed through the fjord, bouncing off rock walls until it seemed the entire valley vibrated. Crews on the ground developed a rhythm of service that bordered on choreography. Fuel trucks moved into place the moment wheels touched down. Mechanics checked tires and struts. Navigators grabbed weather reports. And by the time crews had stretched their legs, the aircraft was ready for the next leg. It was not without chaos. Icebergs drifted into the fjord, sometimes within sight of the runway threshold. Tugboats idled nearby, ready to nudge the frozen giants aside before they threatened an approach. Men joked that Greenland was the only place in the world where you might wave off a landing because of a mountain of ice floating in your final turn. The reality was deadly serious. An iceberg drifting too close could reflect radio signals, obscure visual cues, or simply cause a pilot to hesitate at the worst possible moment. Clearing them was as important as clearing snow. Accident rates were inevitable. Aircraft skidded off runways glazed with ice. Engines coughed and failed in the cold, and more than a few landings ended with bent props or cracked wings. yet the numbers remained surprisingly low compared to early fears. Ferry Command had expected catastrophic losses. What they got instead was a system that worked, even if it demanded constant vigilance. Each successful crossing built confidence. By late 1943, the movement of aircraft across Greenland had become almost routine, a dangerous word, but proof that the bridge held. Statistics tell part of the story. Tens of thousands of landings were recorded at Greenland's airfields during the war. B-17s, B-24s, and later the sleek P-51s all passed through. For the ground crews, each airplane was another tally, another success. They did not think in grand strategy but in practical terms. Did the aircraft arrive? Was it fueled? Did it leave safely? If yes, the system was working. The pilots thought in more personal terms. For them, each successful hop meant one less ocean to cross, one step closer to home or to battle. The tempo strained everyone. Mechanics worked in gloves stiff with frost, crawling beneath wings while wind scoured their faces raw. Fuel handlers wrestled with hoses that froze solid between uses. Cooks in the mess halls served meals at odd hours. Since flights did not respect schedules, even sleep became irregular. A bomber might land at midnight in a snowstorm, and the entire base would rouse itself to turn it around. No one complained. They understood that each delay rippled across the chain, endangering more crews down the line. Despite the hardships, the tempo created pride. Men wrote home about the sight of an endless line of aircraft stretching down the fjord, lights blinking in the Arctic twilight. They spoke of the satisfaction of watching a squadron lift off into the gray sky, knowing their work had made it possible. The statistics on paper became stories in memory. The time a P-38 limped in on one engine. The night a formation appeared through snow like ghosts. The morning, an entire flight of Mustangs took off and vanished into the east, bound for a war that seemed very far away and yet intimately connected to that strip of steel in Greenland. As 1944 rolled on, the system proved itself beyond doubt. Aircraft arrived faster than ever, squadrons crossed in waves, and the airfields expanded to meet demand. What had begun as an experiment on a frozen shore became a lifeline, measured not just in machines, but in the lives those machines would later protect. The ice runways had done more than support aircraft. They had supported an entire strategy. And every time an iceberg drifted aside, every time another bomber climbed out of the fjord, the men who watched knew they were part of something larger than themselves. Behind the numbers and the maps were people, ordinary men pulled into extraordinary circumstances on the edge of the Arctic. The ferry chain could not have worked without their stubbornness. Each post, each hut, each runway had its stories, told in the small details of daily life that never reached official reports. The engineers were the first to arrive and the last to leave. They worked with machines that broke as often as they ran. A bulldozer might sink into a thawed patch of permafrost, and the only way to save it was to lash cables to trucks and pull until something gave. Men joked that the mud ate more equipment than the enemy ever did. In winter, they swung sledgehammers in darkness, their beards frosted white, the sound echoing through valleys where only the wind had spoken before. Some wrote in journals that they learned to judge the ground by feel. The crunch of frozen gravel meant the mat would hold. The slosh of thawing soil meant disaster. Meteorologists lived in isolation few could imagine. Some huts sat alone on ridges above the fjords, battered by storms that shook their very frames. They kept radios humming and balloons rising. In the silence, they invented routines, reading, whittling, playing cards by lamplight. One man remembered carving chess pieces from ice, only to watch them melt into puddles on the stove. Their reports carried no glamour, just strings of numbers tapped out through static, but those numbers guided squadrons across oceans. They knew that somewhere out there, a crew trusted their voices more than the compass in front of them. The rescue teams lived in readiness. Ski planes sat tethered on the snow, engines tested daily, always waiting for the next call. The men slept lightly, knowing a crash could come at any hour. When word arrived, they hauled sleds into cargo holds, packed rations, and braced for the white emptiness of the ice cap. Missions stretched into days. They dug shelters, shared cigarettes with stranded airmen, and sometimes carried bodies home. Many later said they feared the silence more than the cold. The silence meant they might be too late. The pilots themselves left a different kind of memory. They were young, many barely in their 20s, yet entrusted with machines that could alter the course of war. For them, Greenland was a proving ground. They spoke of the first glimpse of the fjord as a mixture of dread and relief, of hearing engines echo against cliffs like a chorus of ghosts. They remembered the taste of coffee in mess halls that smelled of diesel and coal, the sound of ice cracking in the bay, the sight of the aurora shimmering green across a sky that seemed to mock their exhaustion. Some called Greenland beautiful, others called it cursed. All agreed it was unforgettable. There were friendships, too, unlikely and enduring. Engineers and pilots shared stories over tin cups. Coast Guard sailors swapped rations with meteorologists. Local Greenlanders, hired to help haul supplies or guide across treacherous terrain, became part of the lifeline. Hunters taught Americans how to read snowdrifts, how to spot signs of thin ice, how to find shelter when storms closed in. Those lessons saved lives, though they never made it into official manuals. Even in such harshness, moments of humor broke through. A pilot once painted a polar bear on the nose of his bomber after spotting one wandering near the runway. A mechanic rigged a sled out of scrap wood and spent his free time sliding down icy hills, laughing like a boy. Someone brewed a batch of beer from canned fruit, producing a drink so vile that the story of it became a running joke through the winter. These moments mattered. They reminded men that they were still human, that war had not erased joy entirely. For all their efforts, recognition was scarce. Greenland was not Normandy or Iwo Jima. It was not the setting of grand battles or headlines. Yet those who served there carried a quiet pride. They knew that each bomber that landed safely in Britain owed something to their work. The ice runways did not fire a shot, but they delivered the machines that did. Without them, the war would have dragged longer, costlier, perhaps differently. In letters home, the men wrote about the cold, about the endless nights, about the strange mix of beauty and desolation. Some confessed they longed for warmth more than victory, for the smell of grass or the sight of a tree. Others admitted that when they finally left Greenland, they felt a pang of loss. The land had marked them. They had built something enduring out of nothing, carved runways where none should exist, and in doing so had become part of a story larger than themselves. The people of Greenland's runways were not famous. Their names rarely appear in textbooks, but they were the bridge as surely as the steel beneath the bomber's wheels. Their sweat, their endurance, their laughter in the face of misery made the snowball route real, and when the war ended, they carried home the memory of a place where ice became runway, where silence became signal, and where ordinary men held up the weight of a continent's war on their shoulders. By 1945, the urgency was gone, but the legacy remained. The air bridge across Greenland had done its work. Thousands of aircraft had crossed, delivering power to Britain at the moment it was needed most. The war moved on, sweeping into France and Germany. But in Greenland, the runways stood quiet in the Arctic light, reminders of an extraordinary gamble that had paid off. When the war ended, some bases were abandoned almost overnight. Barracks stood empty, radios silent, fuel drums left rusting on the tundra, yet others remained, repurposed for civilian use. Narsarsuaq, once Bluey West 1, became Greenland's first international airport. Its fjord approach still tested pilots long after the bombers were gone, a challenge passed down from one generation of aviators to the next. Sundra Strömfjord, later called Kangerlussuaq, grew into a hub for both military and civilian flights, its long runway serving as a bridge not just for warplanes, but for commercial aircraft connecting continents. The lessons learned there shaped aviation far beyond Greenland. Engineers had discovered how to build on permafrost, how to manage drainage in frozen ground, how to use steel matting to create runways in impossible places. These techniques migrated into Alaska, Siberia, and the high north, forming the foundation of Cold War air strategy. Every jet that later screamed across polar skies carried in its flight plan echoes of the first B-17 that dared to descend into Narsarsuaq's fjord. The weather network endured, too. Stations built in hardship continued as part of global meteorological systems. They provided data that guided not only aircraft, but also shipping and scientific research. The men who had once struggled to launch balloons in blizzards could hardly have imagined that their small posts would form part of an international system, helping humanity understand the polar climate in ways critical to the modern world. Greenland itself was changed. The presence of thousands of Americans left traces in local communities. Some Greenlanders found steady work for the first time hauling supplies, guiding patrols, or maintaining equipment. Families remembered the years when the fjords buzzed with foreign aircraft, when strangers brought radios, medical care, and technology into villages that had lived unchanged for centuries. It was disruptive, sometimes unsettling, but it also connected Greenland to a global story that would never again pass it by. For the veterans, the legacy was more personal. Many returned decades later, standing at the ends of runways they had once built in haste, now paved and modern. They remembered nights of fear when the aurora lit the sky above a line of bombers waiting to take off. They recalled the groan of steel matting under frozen tires, the hiss of wind through guy wires, the warmth of a single stove in a drafty hut. They looked out over the fjords and thought of the men who had not come back, their aircraft buried forever in the ice. To them, Greenland was both triumph and tomb. In history books, the focus often falls on the great battles: Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway. Yet wars are also won in places that never see a shot fired. Greenland was one of those places. Its runways did not blaze with gunfire, but they carried the machines that tipped the balance. They proved that persistence could turn frozen wilderness into strategy. They showed that in war, logistics is destiny. Today, as jets arc across the North Atlantic with barely a thought, the old runways remain. Some are still in use, others lie quiet, their steel long gone, their outlines fading into moss and stone, but the memory remains sharp. Once, on the edge of the world, men carved airfields out of ice and rock and kept the lifeline to Europe alive. The bombers that thundered down those strips carried more than fuel and bombs. They carried proof that ingenuity could tame even the Arctic, that determination could build a bridge where none had existed. That is Greenland's legacy. The ice runways of Greenland were born from desperation, but they left behind something larger than victory. They demonstrated that human will could bend even the Arctic to its purpose. What began as a stopgap, steel planking rolled out on frozen soil, snow packed into makeshift strips, became a lesson in how to operate where nature had never invited flight. The legacy spread in unexpected ways. After the war, the U.S. Air Force built an entire strategy on the idea that the shortest path to Europe and Asia was across the pole. Bases in Alaska, Canada, and Greenland drew directly on the lessons of WWII and WWII. Engineers reused techniques for stabilizing permafrost. Meteorologists applied the data collected under hardship to improve global forecasting. Even commercial airlines adopted the northern shortcuts, confident that the Arctic could be crossed because men had already proved it. Science followed war. Those weather huts and airstrips became platforms for research. Glaciologists, geologists, and climate scientists all used the same regions where once bulldozers had fought mud and frost. They studied the ice cap, tracked atmospheric changes, and eventually contributed to the earliest understanding of global warming. Without the accidental laboratories of wartime Greenland, much of that science would have been delayed. Culturally, the story slipped into obscurity, overshadowed by louder tales of battles and victories. Yet among veterans and locals, it lived on. Pilots told their children about the fjord approach at Narsarsuaq. Engineers described how they built a runway out of nothing. Greenlanders remembered the years when their quiet valleys roared with foreign engines. In small museums, relics from the bases, fragments of matting, rusted tools, faded photographs, still speak of a time when the Arctic was a front line. The emotional memory is perhaps the deepest. For the men who flew the route, Greenland was a crucible. It tested not only skill, but endurance. They remembered nights when snow erased the horizon, mornings when the runway lights cut through fog like salvation. They remembered the faces of comrades rescued from the ice, or the silence of those who never returned. The runways were more than steel and snow. They were lifelines, fragile threads stretched across a vast emptiness, and they held. When the last bombers had flown and the war ended, the world barely noticed the quiet triumph in Greenland. But without it, the great offensives of 1943 and 1944 would have been delayed, perhaps blunted. The ice runways helped move not just machines, but history itself. They proved that sometimes the decisive battles are fought not with bullets, but with ingenuity, sweat, and the courage to land on a strip of steel in a frozen fjord. Today, jets cross the Atlantic in hours, their paths guided by satellites and radar. Few passengers look down and think of Greenland, but the echoes remain. The fjords still hold the outlines of runways. The ground still carries scars where steel once lay. And in those scars lies the story of how an isolated island of ice became a bridge between continents. The ice runways of Greenland remind us that victory is not only measured in firepower, it is also measured in persistence, in the ability to find solutions where none seem possible, in the quiet heroism of men who fought mud and frost as fiercely as any enemy. That is their legacy, not just a chapter of war, but a testament to what human determination can build on the edge of the world.